A routine trip to the grocery store took an unexpected and unforgettable turn when an elderly woman made a remark that would shake the very air around her. The afternoon sun bathed the small Ohio neighborhood in a golden hue, casting soft shadows along the pavement as locals bustled about their daily errands. Inside the grocery store, the aisles hummed with quiet conversations, the rustling of plastic bags and the rhythmic squeak of cartwheels gliding over polished floors. Some shoppers moved with purpose, their lists committed to memory, while others drifted aimlessly, lost in thought. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, likely in her late 70s, adjusted her glasses with a sigh. Her delicate fingers, weathered with age, trembled slightly as she reached for a bag of apples. Dressed in a faded cardigan and a neatly pinned silver bun, she seemed unassuming at first glance, just another face in the crowd. But in the next moment, her presence would carve a deep, uncomfortable silence into the heart of the store. A young black man named Darrell approached the nearby stand, reaching for a bag of oranges. He moved with ease, his tall frame relaxed, his blue hoodie slightly wrinkled from the afternoon's wear. He balanced a basket of groceries in one hand while his other thumbed through his phone. His expression was neutral, calm, almost indifferent to the world around him, until a voice shattered the ordinary rhythm of his day. The elderly woman's gaze locked onto him, her lips pursed, eyes narrowing as if something about his presence unsettled her. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. Her voice was sharp, clear enough to carry beyond the few feet between them. "You people don't belong here." The words sliced through the air like a jagged blade, abrupt and deliberate. Darrell's fingers froze over his phone, his body momentarily still. A few shoppers in the vicinity stiffened, some exchanging uneasy glances, while others quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to have heard. But the woman wasn't finished. Her voice, unwavering and edged with something colder than mere irritation, cut through the hush that had settled over the produce section. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The atmosphere in the store thickened, heavy and oppressive, as though the walls had inched closer, suffocating the space between them. Conversations halted mid-sentence, carts stood abandoned in the middle of aisles, and a few frozen dinners sat half-stocked in an employee's hands as he, too, turned to witness what would happen next. Darrell's heartbeat quickened, though outwardly he remained eerily still. His grip tightened on the handle of his grocery basket, knuckles paling under the pressure. His initial instinct was to fire back, to demand an explanation for such unwarranted hostility, but instead he drew in a slow, measured breath. His eyes, deep, contemplative, locked onto hers, searching for something beneath the hostility, something beyond the venom of her words. The elderly woman did not waver. If anything, her posture stiffened, as though bracing for whatever response might come. Her chin lifted defiantly, her grip on her apples firm, as if expecting resistance, expecting anger. Perhaps she wanted it. A mother nearby clutched her young child's hand and quietly ushered them toward another aisle. An older gentleman standing near the potatoes hesitated, watching the scene unfold with wary eyes, unsure if he should step in or simply observe from a safe distance. A young employee stacking bananas a few feet away fumbled with a bunch, his hands suddenly unsteady. The silence that followed was thick, tangible, stretching far beyond the space between them. It was not just silence, it was anticipation, a moment that carried the weight of history, of struggle, of 1,000 moments like this one before it. And in that silence, Darrell stood at the center, a man forced to make a choice in the face of hate. A hush fell over the store, every movement suddenly feeling slower, more deliberate. A cashier craned her neck to see past the growing crowd, though no one dared to step closer, not a single person walked away. They were all witnesses now, whether they wanted to be or not. Darrell stood still for a moment, his face unreadable, his fingers tightening around the handle of his basket. 1,000 possible responses surged through his mind, each one louder than the last. He could lash out, he could walk away, he could match her cruelty with fury, but none of those choices felt right. Instead, he let out a slow, controlled breath, shifting his basket to his other hand as he straightened his posture. His presence seemed to grow in the silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, yet deliberate, cutting clean through the tension that gripped the air. "Ma'am," he began, his tone even, his words carefully measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question was not an accusation, but an invitation, an opportunity for her to reconsider, to hear herself, to reflect. But she showed no interest in self-reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice louder now, filled with defiance. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." The weight of her words pressed against the room like an unbearable force. A young woman near the bread aisle gasped audibly. The quiet murmurs of the onlookers grew in volume, a low ripple of disbelief spreading through them. But Darrell did not waver. He did not raise his voice. He did not close the distance between them. Instead, he let the pause stretch, allowing her words to hang in the air long enough for everyone to feel their full impact. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly. His restraint was not weakness, it was power, and the strength of his composure was almost unsettling. "Let's talk about that," he continued, "since you brought it up." The store seemed to collectively hold its breath. A storm was brewing, but it was not the kind anyone had anticipated. With deliberate care, Darrell set his basket down on the floor. The simple motion felt significant, as if grounding himself in the moment, commanding attention without force. His presence was magnetic, drawing in even those who had initially pretended not to listen. His gaze met hers, unwavering, not with anger but with a quiet, unshakable resolve that made the elderly woman shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he said, his voice steady, firm, and measured. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Each word carried weight, carefully chosen, deliberately placed. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to take root. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back day after day so his children might have a better future. His father, my great-great-great-grandfather, was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like cattle. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The woman's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The crowd, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, who had been scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly, put it away entirely. An older couple whispered to each other, but never turned their gaze away from Darrell. He continued, his voice steady but growing in strength, his words now carrying an unshakable force. "My grandfather fought in World War II," he said, his eyes dark with meaning. "He put his life on the line for a country that sent him overseas to risk everything, only to treat him like he was nothing when he came home. He wasn't allowed to sit at the same counters. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in the promise of this country, even when it refused to believe in him." A thick, heavy silence blanketed the store. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to quiet. "And my parents," he went on, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "They fought too, not with weapons or fists, but by waking up every single day and working hard, by choosing kindness, by choosing respect, by believing in the values they were told this country stood for. My mother? She's a teacher. She spent her entire life helping children, no matter what they look like. My father? He's a mechanic, the kind of man who wouldn't think twice about stopping on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car ever broke down." His words hung in the air, settling deep into the bones of those who heard them. He locked eyes with the woman, and though his voice was calm, there was a sadness beneath it, a weight of centuries of history pressing down on the moment. "So tell me again," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "You think I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, the corners of his mouth pressing into a grim line. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid for this country in blood, in sweat, in sacrifice." The elderly woman's face flushed a deep red. her hands trembling around the apples she still held. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but her voice faltered, catching in her throat before it ever had the chance to escape. Darryl took a slow step back, his composure unwavering. He wasn't just addressing her anymore. His words were for everyone within earshot. "I could have walked away," he said, his voice carrying through the silence. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't disappear in silence. We all have a responsibility to be better, to rise above words like those." The weight of his words settled over the room like a thick fog. But this moment wasn't over yet. The real test was still to come. For a long beat, no one moved. The hush that followed was so absolute it was almost deafening. The elderly woman's expression was an unsteady mix of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something else, something harder to define, something that looked an awful lot like shame. She glanced around as though searching for an ally, someone who might defend her, but no one stepped forward. Then finally, movement. A middle-aged man in a worn baseball cap stepped forward. "He's right," the man said, his voice breaking the silence. "We have to be better than this." His words seemed to break a dam. An older woman near the frozen food section nodded solemnly, her voice thick with emotion. "My father fought in that same war," she said softly, "and he always told me the only color that mattered was the red in the flag." Murmurs spread through the crowd, voices finding courage in the space Darryl had created. Near the registers, a young cashier, barely out of her teens, called out from behind the counter. "I've never seen someone handle something like that with so much grace," she admitted. "Thank you." The elderly woman, visibly rattled now, gripped her cart as if for support. She didn't apologize, but something in her had shifted. The fire in her eyes had dulled. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "I didn't mean—" she started, but the words trailed off, unfinished, like she wasn't sure how to fix what had already been said. Darryl turned to her, his expression softer now, less confrontational but no less resolute. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter, but actions matter even more." From the deli counter, someone began to clap, slowly at first, hesitant, but then more joined in. The sound grew, swelling into something undeniable, not just applause for Darryl's words, but for the dignity it took to confront hate without letting it consume him. The elderly woman looked around one last time, her face pale, her hand still gripping her cart. Then, wordlessly, she turned and wheeled it toward the exit. As she disappeared through the automatic doors, a few people moved toward Darryl. A woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saying what needed to be said." Darryl exhaled, a faint smile touching his lips. He picked up his basket, his grip sure. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure the truth is heard." The crowd slowly dispersed, the tension in the air shifting into something else: reflection, understanding. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but no one remained unchanged. The moment had passed, but its impact remained. It would linger long after the echoes of their footsteps had faded. As Darryl moved toward the checkout, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier rang up his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there?" She hesitated before continuing. "It meant a lot. Most people wouldn't have stood up like that. At least, not with so much grace." Darryl returned the smile, his voice warm but steady. "Sometimes grace is the only thing that cuts through," he said. "Anger just builds more walls." Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting golden light across the parking lot. As Darryl walked to his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel as though deep in thought. For a brief moment, he considered walking over, but he didn't. Some lessons take time to sink in, and he had already said everything that needed to be said. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his father, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, hands folded, his face unreadable. When Darrell finished, the older man sat in silence for a moment before finally speaking. "You did the right thing, son," his father said, his voice low but firm. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. You made a difference. People like her, they may not change overnight, but you planted a seed. And sometimes that's all you can do. Plant the seed and trust that, in time, it will grow." Darrell nodded, his father's words settling deep within him. The confrontation had been uncomfortable, even painful, but necessary. Change doesn't happen in silence. Ignorance remains when it is left unchallenged. But the moment you shine a light on it, cracks begin to form. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, her plate of food untouched. Darrell's words echoed in her mind, each syllable cutting through the walls she had built over the years. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they were inheriting. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't before: doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had transpired in the grocery store rippled through the community. People spoke about Darrell's composure, his strength, and the unwavering dignity with which he handled the moment. It was no longer just an incident. It became a lesson, a testament to the power of words, and a reminder of the importance of standing firm in the face of prejudice. Darrell never sought recognition for what he had done, but the impact of his actions stretched further than he had imagined. Strangers approached him, their voices heavy with gratitude, sharing their own experiences of bias and perseverance. Conversations that had long been avoided were finally being spoken aloud. And change, slow but certain, began to take root. Even the elderly woman found herself shifting. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little she started questioning the beliefs she had clung to for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever cross paths with Darrell again, but if she did, she hoped she would have the courage to say what had been weighing on her heart. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Moments like these remind us that kindness, courage, and truth wield an unmatched power. They show us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean holding your ground with quiet conviction and letting truth do the work. To everyone who bears witness to moments like these, let this be a lesson. Your words and actions have weight. They can wound or they can heal. They can divide or they can unite. If this story resonated with you, don't just let it pass you by. Share it. Speak about it. Let's amplify voices of strength, hope, and understanding. Together we can make the world a place where dignity triumphs over hate, where knowledge replaces ignorance, and where the seeds we plant today bloom into a better tomorrow.